Hi guys, welcome to my channel, Amy Howard Art. I'm Amy, and today's tutorial video I'm going to show you how you can draw this really beautiful, colourful kingfisher. Now you may have seen this kingfisher in last week's video for the Animal Artists Collective, and I thought I really want to make a tutorial on this guy, so this is what you've got for today. So for this drawing I started off in exactly the same place as I usually start, and that is with the eyes. I always like to start with the eyes because I feel like it gives the subject which I'm drawing a little bit of a soul, and it just helps with capturing the personality and the overall sort of feel of the subject which I'm drawing. So for the eye here, there wasn't really much detail because bird eyes are those really beady sort of glassy eyes. So pretty much all I did was I just went through with a really sharp dark sepia pencil and I just outlined the outer edge of the eye, and then I went through and just outlined all of the edges of the highlight and all of the dark areas within the actual eye itself. So there wasn't very much colour that actually went through the eye, it was pretty much just that dark sepia tone, and all I did was just layered really lightly to begin with, just to make sure that I got the shape and everything in correctly. And then I just went through and just added a harder pressure and a couple more layers on those darkest areas. And then for the highlight there was a little bit of a transition between the sky and this really bright area. So all I did was just went through with a really light layer of the Caran d'Ache Luminance Violet Grey pencil. It's this really sort of greyy, really lavendery tone, and I just added a really light layer of that onto the left hand side. With the eye complete, I then went through and added a few of the darker feathers around the eye, and then eventually worked my way towards the beak. And the beak is one of my most favourite parts to draw when doing birds because it's a completely different texture and you get to play with all of these reflections, so it's kind of similar to working with eyes. So all I did for the beak was just went through and added in all of those dark areas with a sharp dark sepia pencil, and then I went through and added a base layer. For this I used the buff titanium and a little bit of the silver grey, both of those from the Caran d'Ache Luminance range, and then I went through and just fleshed out some of the colours which I could see going through there. So on the reference photo there was a really strong orange tone underneath the beak, and then through the middle of the beak there was this really nice purple tone, and then working up towards a blue tone on the top of the beak. So on the bottom half I just layered some of the colours which I had picked out for the orange feathers. So that consisted of an apricot from the Caran d'Ache Luminance, some orange glaze and a little bit of terracotta, and to get that really nice smooth look I just burnished with the buff titanium and the white pencil. Through the middle of the beak you had those purple tones, so I just went through with some violet grey and just really layered that, and I coupled that with a little bit of the orange just to get this really nice bright tone, and working those purple and orange tones together they really set each other off. So putting those two colours next to each other is a really good idea because they really set each other off. You layer the purple next to the orange and you get these really vibrant oranges, and putting the orange next to the purple, again you get these really nice, really vibrant violety purple tones. Through the top of the beak I just added a little bit of the silver grey and some Payne's Grey 30%, and then burnished that out with a little bit of the white pencil. For the nostril of the beak I just went through and added some more of those orange tones, added a little bit of shadow with some burnt sienna, and then added some more shadow with the dark sepia. So once I'd finished with that beak, then it was time to tackle one of the most difficult parts of this drawing, and that was the top of the head. Now on the kingfisher's head you've got these really light patches and these really dark patches, and it's kind of like he's got some kind of net over his head is the best way that I can describe it. So what I did for this was I actually put down some base layers. So I went through with some silver grey from the Caran d'Ache Luminance, and I chose that colour because it was a perfect blend of a grey with a blue tone, and that's what I really wanted to put down as a base here. So I went through with that silver grey and made sure that it was really sharp so that I could get a really nice smooth even coverage of that pencil for the base layer. and what I did was followed the direction that the feathers were going. So around the head towards the top of the eye, the feathers were kind of coming upwards, and then as you worked your way down towards the neck of the bird, they were sort of curving round. So I made sure that I put that base layer down in that manner. Once I'd done that, then I went through and started to build up those blue and those green tones. So I used three main colours for this part. I used a light phthalo blue, some cobalt turquoise and some cobalt green, and those were really perfect colours for this. So I started off with the lightest, being the light phthalo blue, and I slowly built that up using it in the same way that I used that base layer, so making sure it was really nice and sharp and using really light pressure and working in the direction of the feathers. I then built up to my darker blue, the cobalt turquoise and the cobalt green, and I started to build those colours pretty much all over, and then I concentrated a few more layers in the darker areas. And the darker areas here were around the eye and at the top of that little beak section, and also as you was working around towards the back of the neck. So I concentrated a few more layers of those blue colours in those areas. Once I then built up those blue tones, I then went in and started to add all of these really dark sort of mottled. The only way that I can really describe it is that I like to think of it as like the kingfisher's brain, and it's kind of like a really wiggly dark kind of texture, and all I did was just used a dark sepia pencil, made sure it was really nice and sharp. And to begin with, I just went in with really light pressure and just mapped out a few of those really dark areas on the top of the head. So by using that light pressure, I could easily map them out, and then if I did make a mistake, I could easily erase. Once I was happy with the positioning and all of that kind of thing with those dark areas, then I went over with a secondary layer of the dark sepia and a little bit of a heavier pressure and really penciled those in and really made them nice and dark. And I concentrated a lot more of the layers and a bit more pressure in those areas where you had those darker blues, so around the eyes, around the top of the beak and around the back of the neck. To get the feather texture for this, all I did was just use really tiny short lines with my pencil, again making sure that it was really nice and sharp so you could get those sharp details in, and just made really short lines when I was adding in those dark areas. So I didn't make really long flowing lines because that would have made the kingfisher look too furry. I just made really short, almost pinprick marks with my pencil as I was adding in those dark areas. With that complete, I could breathe a sigh of relief. The hardest part of this portrait was done, or the hardest part of the bird was done, and then I started to add all of that lovely orange underneath the eye, and again a little bit more of that blue at the base of the beak. So for the orange here, I used three colours. I used a mixture of apricot from the Caran d'Ache Luminance, some terracotta and some orange glaze, and again I used these in exactly the same way as I did with the blue colours. I put down a base layer. The base layer for the orange feathers was actually buff titanium, and then I built from my lightest orange to my darkest orange, focusing some more layers of that darker orange and a little bit of a harder pressure in the darker areas. And again, I used the same kind of strokes with my pencil for this. I just made really short lines, and I added in a few lines of burnt sienna and dark sepia for a little bit of added shadow. The white sections on this kingfisher were pretty much just filled in by using a couple layers of the buff titanium, a little bit of the silver grey, and then I added a little few areas of Payne's grey 30% and some warm grey 3, just again to add some shadow where you had the overlap of some of the blue feathers and the overlap of some of the orange feathers. The next task was that really vibrant blue wing, and I went about this exactly the same way as I did the head of the bird. All I did was put down a base layer of the silver grey, then I worked in those blue tones, slowly working from that lighter blue to the darker blue, and I just worked in the direction of the feathers. I made sure that I paid really close attention to that reference photo, and I worked in the direction that they were going. So on my drawing I had two different directions. You've got the top part of the wing where you've got it curving around towards the breast of the bird, and then you've got that bottom half of the wing that were pointing towards the tail and the branch. So I had to make sure that I worked in those two directions, and I made sure that I compared it to the reference to make sure that it was absolutely correct in order to achieve that level of realism. Once those blue tones were down, then I started to go in and add some shadows with some of the Payne's Grey 30%, and then eventually worked up to the dark sepia, again adding in all of those really dark marks of the Kingfisher, so all of those shadows around the back of the wing. And on the bottom half of the wing you've got some little separation where you've got some shadow going underneath. For that I just made sure that I used a really sharp dark sepia pencil, and I made really precise lines coming from the bottom of that bit of wing towards the top. And I also interlaced some of that with the cobalt turquoise to give that dark sepia and that shadow a little bit more of a blue hue. The wings of the Kingfisher and also on the head contain these really light sections that I was really struggling to get just by using the coloured pencils. So once I'd gone through and added all of my blue tones and all of the shadows and everything that I needed to add with all of the darker pencils, I then tried to pick out some of those really light spots with the white pencil, the Caran d'Ache Luminance White, but I couldn't quite get them there and they weren't really poking out and catching my eye as much as I had hoped, so I actually went through with a little bit of a white gel pen just to really highlight those areas. With the wings complete, it was time to move on to that really vibrant orange breast, and this was one of my favourite parts to do, especially underneath the wing towards the legs. And all I did for this was just put down a nice layer of some buff titanium. I also worked in some dark cadmium yellow just for a really subtle yellow hue, and then I worked in those apricots, that terracotta, that orange glaze. I just used a really light hand with my pencil, barely putting any pressure through it at all, made sure the pencil was really sharp and just worked in the direction that the feathers were going in. For the shadows on the Kingfisher, I mainly used a combination of burnt sienna and the Van Dyke brown, but I also used a few little subtle details with the Caput Mortuum violet as well. When I first approached these orange feathers, I made sure that I used really light layers, because when I've used the apricot from the Caran d'Ache Luminance in the past, when I've used too much pressure, the colour has come out really vibrant and really too vibrant for my liking. So I made sure that I went in with light pressure and sort of minimal colour of that apricot. But I found with this that I actually needed that really vibrant orange tone to really set those blue feathers off. When I first had those really light layers down, it wasn't really popping as much as I wanted it to, so I went through and I added a heavier layer of the apricot colour, and then it really started to come to life. And because I went through and darkened the breast with that apricot colour, I then needed to go through and darken all of those shadow areas. So I just went through with a bit more of the burnt sienna and the Van Dyke brown, just using a little bit of a heavier pressure and a few more layers in those darker areas, which was mainly next to that blue wing and underneath the bird. And as we come down the bird, you've got these really wispy, really white feathers between the feet, and you've got some really white feathers on the breast as well, and those were really fun to try and do. And all I did was just avoided putting those really vibrant orange colours in those areas, so I just sort of marked them off, just worked around them, and then I really highlighted that really white, really light tone just by adding a few little areas of the darker colours underneath and beside them. So I added a little bit of the burnt sienna and the Van Dyke brown directly underneath those white areas to really accent them, to really make them look like they were sort of really light and fluffy. The shadowing underneath the bird was one of my favourites to do, and this is where I used a majority of the Caput Mortuum violet. Using that really sort of browny purple tone here, again, really set that orange colour off, and I was really pleased with the effect that this was able to achieve. So this is the same kind of technique which I applied when drawing the beak. I mentioned that I used the purple and the orange next to each other to really offset one another, and this is the same technique which I applied beneath the legs here. To achieve that really nice feathery down, all I did was just made sure that all of my colours were really blended nicely together. For this portrait I actually burnished with the Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil, and I just went through and added a few areas of those darker colours. So I used some dark sepia and some burnt sienna and the Van Dyke brown just to add a few little lines of those darker colours, and that really gives it this really nice soft feathery down effect. The feet of the kingfisher were really simple to do. All I did was put down that base layer. I used the buff titanium for this, and then I just layered the same colours which I applied to the breast, but I applied them in multiple layers. So I applied more layers of those orange colours to the feet than I did to the breast to really make them look a lot darker. And I also mixed the orange a lot with the burnt sienna to try and get this really sort of browny red tone which the feet were giving off. A lot of people find bird feet a little bit difficult to draw, and I must admit it is one thing which I struggle with when drawing birds, but all you need to make sure you do is just look at where your lights and darks are and then apply them appropriately to your drawing. So if you are struggling to identify your lights and your darks, what I suggest you do is just squint at your reference picture. It sort of blurs the mid-tones and you can easily pick out those lights and those darks areas. One thing that I did make sure that I did for the feet was make sure they were really nice and smooth and shiny and kind of really glossy looking. So I just went through and I really burnished those to really get them to look nice and smooth. I didn't want them to look hairy or feathery like the breast or the rest of the bird. I really wanted them to have that distinct texture of being really nice and smooth. So I just went through with a really heavy layer of the white pencil to really burnish those out. So the last thing on this portrait was the bark, and this is a texture which a lot of people really don't like drawing, but for me it's one of my favourite things to do because I really like that contrast of textures. I like to be able to work on the different texture of the bark. I always get to work on fur and feathers, but it's not often that I get to work on bark or rocks or something like that. So this is one of my most favourite parts to do for this, and it's really simple to actually render. All you need to keep in mind is your lights and your darks, and you need to just map out the shapes of whatever your bark is making. So on mine here I had a mixture of wood which was kind of wet and glossy, and I had a little bit of dry wood, and of course you've got these sort of little mossy tendrils which were laying on the bark as well. So all I did for this was just think of it in terms of shapes, and your drawing is a lot simpler when you think of things in terms of shapes and not the actual object that it is. So for the little mossy tendrils I just looked at them as little triangles or little arcs or little half circles, and then just filled in some of the really dark details underneath or beside some of those moss to create that kind of weird texture. I just went through with a dark sepia pencil, made sure that it was really sharp because that's really crucial to getting those really fine sharp details. So the moss on my reference was actually a really yellowy green colour, and as I was working to a limited palette I didn't actually pick out a green, and I didn't pick out a green because I had yellow on my palette and I had blue on my palette, and I thought that I could create a really unique green and I could really replicate the colour that I was seeing for that moss. So for the colour that I've got down on the moss, I just put down a base layer of some buff titanium. I went over with a really light layer of some dark cadmium yellow. I then went over with some light phthalo blue, and then again went over with that yellow pencil, and it created this really unique, really kind of mossy yellowy green colour, and I was really pleased with the effect that this was able to create. And it just goes to show that you don't necessarily have to pick out every single colour which you see within a reference photo. You can pick out a yellow and you can pick out a blue and you can make your own colour. And that's something which I think everybody should keep in mind, that they don't necessarily have to pick out 100 million colours to create one portrait. You can just use a handful of colours to create what you want. So as I said, the bark and everything within this was just made up of me looking at the shapes that the reference was giving me and then applying that to my drawing. Putting down the base layers of some buff titanium, I added a really light layer of some burnt sienna, but a majority of this was actually made up with some Van Dyke brown and some dark sepia. So the dark parts on the bark were just made up of those two colours along with the base layer, and then the lighter areas were just made up of the base layer and then some really fine layers of burnt sienna and then burnishing with that white pencil. There's a little bit of a violet tone where the bark was a little bit wet and light was shining off of it, and to create that effect all I did was really lightly layered some violet grey and some Caput Mortuum violet and really burnished that out with the white pencil to get this really subtle sort of violety purple tone. One tip which I think is really essential when you are drawing a subject which is on a material like this, so if you've got a bird on a branch or anything that's sitting on rocks or anything, is think it's really essential that you get the shadows from where that creature or whatever you're drawing is sitting correct. For me, it was getting the shadows around the feet and the underneath of the tail of the bird correct. And that's what really gives this piece depth, and it's what really brings it to life and just gives it that little bit of an extra edge. So you really want to pay attention to the shadows of your piece. They are really, really important. I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this tutorial. I really enjoyed drawing this kingfisher. It's one of my favourites so far this year. I got to use all of those lovely blues, those greens and some of those oranges. It was just a really fun piece to create. If you want to follow along with this tutorial in real time, there is a 4.5-hour version available on my Patreon and my website. I'll put a link in the description for you if you want to go and check that out and subscribe over there. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, make sure you give it a big thumbs up. And if you are new around here and you like this one and you want to see more tutorials along with art advice and draw along with me live streams, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon to be notified of all of my future videos. And speaking of future videos, I've left a few just over there for you, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!